Breakthrough.
This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching the Freedom Side Live. And I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
It's great to be back with you, Eugene.
As always, I think for both of us, and as always, we have a great show for you. We're touching on all range of things. Of course, the ongoing situation in Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine. We're going to be getting some perspectives from the developing world, which of course are totally shut out of the mainstream media here. And we're also going to be talking about several other important issues, the Minneapolis teacher strike, also student debt in the United States. So plenty for you here on the show, quite a bit. And I will remind those who are watching, make sure you hit subscribe. Also make sure you hit the bell so you get the alerts so you can follow all of the fantastic stuff that we have coming out here on Breakthrough News. So hit subscribe, hit the bell. And one thing I'll also want to mention is that we are also on Telegram now. I'm sure some of you have already seen. So if you're on Telegram, make sure that you follow our Breakthrough News Telegram channel. I believe someone's dropping the link into the chat. But, Ronnie, you look like you want to jump in.
Well, I just wanted to reiterate that you got to hit the like button. So important to get around that algorithmic suppression that so many of us who offer an independent narrative on the world are being subjected to. On top of course, follow us on all platforms, Telegram, Twitter, Instagram. Breakthrough News is where it's at.
Yeah,
I can't believe I
TikTok
just
too.
said that.
Thank you. I don't know.
Very corny.
Yeah, well, you know, that's why.
So, do I sound
write
like a
your
used
lines in
car?
commercials.
Do I sound like a used car salesman?
Kind
Like
of, sort
Breakthrough
of.
News.
Yeah, I'm going to call you
Come on down.
Father of Matilda. Little Roald Dahl
Yeah,
reference for you there.
fair
But
enough.
nevertheless, plenty for you here. Subscribe to us on Telegram, subscribe on YouTube, hit the bell so you get the alerts. Don't expect anyone else to bring it to you. So make sure you are up on everything we have on Breakthrough News. But like I said, we've got a lot for you here on the show. So we want to get into it. And we want to start with a story that many of you may have seen over the weekend. The nation of Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, executed 81 people in one day. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show here by Ali Al-Ahmed, the director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs, and a former Saudi political prisoner. Ali, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, Randy. How are you?
Hello.
How are you? Good to see you again.
If you could, Ali, give us some context for this. I think a lot of people saw, Saudi Arabia executes 81 people, but I think a lot of people were wondering, well, who are these people? What did they do? How does this fit into it? There wasn't a lot of context given in the mainstream media beyond sort of the headlines.
Well, there were 41 protesters and activists who are from the Shia regions in Saudi Arabia. 7 were Yemenis, 1 Syrian, and the rest were from different parts of the country. The 41, like I said, protesters and part of the Shia community who were active. The Yemenis lived there, and they were accused of having sympathies to the Yemenis who are fighting the Saudi invasion, and they were blamed for basically. 2 were captured during battles with the Saudis, these prisoners of war, and they were still executed. The remainder are accused, ISIS people who were accused by the Saudi government of carrying out attacks. But we don't know because Saudi Arabia and its system is a very closed system. The court system is closed. And the information obviously is very controlled. So we don't know exactly their real offenses. But even though if they were to be, if we believe the Saudi government, these were members of ISIS or other extremist groups, there is no way certain to confirm that. Especially we have a history with the Saudi government that they torture everyone basically who is arrested on these or similar charges, political charges, and confessions is the main way of convicting people. And it's usually it's usually what 99% derived from severe torture. And I've written 20 years ago a report, and I think it was the only report on torture and the methods, because I was behind bars, at some point, and I know how they do it, and I've interviewed a lot of people and familiar with the tactics and the way they convict people. So no one who's sentenced in Saudi courts is sentenced fairly. And these sentences should not be accepted by anyone, even against those who actually committed crimes.
Ali, what has been the response from the so-called international community? And of course, when we say international community, this usually refers to the US and European countries, which are in this case all very closely allied with the Saudis, despite the fact that they go around the world imposing punishing policies on countries in the name of human rights and democracy. What has been their reaction to this mass execution in Saudi Arabia?
First of all, we need to know one thing that's important. It has not been reported that these executions were carried on the order of Mohammed bin Salman himself, MBS. This level of execution in Saudi Arabia cannot be carried out or put to reality unless the order comes from what we call the royal court, which is the king's palace, basically, that issues this order. King Salman is not; he doesn't have his wits about him. The person in charge is Mohammed bin Salman. Secondly, is with the U.S. reaction, the main backer of the Saudi monarchy has been basically non-existence. Even during the State Department briefing, where a reporter asked Ned Price about it, he refused to answer or to comment. Even those what I call plastic statements, oh, we are deeply concerned, and we are engaging the Saudis on these issues, and we look forward to continuing working with them and improving the conditions. He even refused to do that, and that's really an expression. It's very important to focus on that. It's an expression that they don't give an F about these souls. It's not even worth a statement. An empty statement has no bearing on anything. Even that, they did not see it fit to issue a statement, either initially or in response to a question. So that tells you the real position. And MBS, if he had thought this would bring even some level of criticism, I don't think he would have carried these executions. What made matters worse, the second day, on Monday, I believe, the top U.S. official in charge of promoting human rights and democracy, Azra Zia, received the former Saudi Minister of Justice, who actually was part of setting this movement of arresting and sentencing some of these people to death. And he had already been part of many executions and torture and abusing women's rights, and you name the list. And she praised him. He was in the State Department, photos published, and so it's like receiving somebody who just gassed some people and said, "Oh, this person is great," and that shows you the level of disconnection and the real policy. The English government, the UK, didn't have even a statement. The European Union had a statement that's it's like the usual word salad that does not condemn or
Right.
let alone lay sanctions on these people who are involved. So yeah, the international reaction has been non-existent. It's important also to realize that the wire services, when they reported the story, they carried the narrative of the government. They did not give the counter narrative of the human rights organizations, especially the indigenous human rights organizations, which they know. I'm familiar with all of these people who write these stories, and I said, call this guy, he knows about this, he's involved. So they did not only not provide the narrative, the alternative narrative, or use the word protesters, because if you say protesters in the wire service instead of terrorists, that makes the Saudis look bad, and it kind of embarrasses their backers in the Washington and London and other Western capitals.
And one thing that I am curious about is, I mean, how does this feel like this is sort of out of step with the typical Saudi behavior? I mean, I think people see things like 81 people executed and they're, shocked, and they should be. I mean, but is this sort of criminalization and use of death sentences, particularly against, protest movements and those fighting for democracy, is this a usual thing for Saudi Arabia, or is this an outlier?
It's important to realize one thing, that the Saudi monarchy, the clan, view protesters as more dangerous than people who carry on armed attacks or terrorist attacks, because the peaceful protest. I'm just going to use one example of he's the brother of a friend of mine who you can see him on video walking in the street and says no to death penalty, and he is one of those people who was tortured severely and executed. So that idea not only threatens the Saudis, because the Saudi government always wanted to give this narrative, which is being replicated or in the West, that the enemies of the Saudi monarchies are these extremists. If we lose the Saudis, we're going to have an ISIS government, and so on. So this narrative is destroyed by people who walk in the street and say, "Stop killing people, stop." So I think the reason that the West wants to keep that, and you can see that in the article of the Atlantic. I remember one time I came across Darrell Issa, the congressman, and I spoke to him, and he's like, "Oh, if we leave the Saudis, we're going to get ISIS." I said, "This is false choice, because there's people like me, many people like me, who wants democracy and human rights and women's rights and all these rights, and even better than the United States." So, but the narrative must be Saudi Arabia or the worst evil. So the lesser evil argument has been used to justify these things. In terms of shock, this is not the first time that the Saudis kill people. This is the Saudi Arabia, the Saudi monarchy has a long history of massacres of thousands of people. Even if you go back to the 1915 or 1925, sorry, when they killed basically nearly 3,000 Yemeni pilgrims who were coming to Yemen killed all of them, and that's called the Tanuma massacre. So massacres are part of the Saudi genealogy. In fact, the Saudi monarchy's genealogy. That's what they do.
And then, of course, this is all happening in the backdrop of this ongoing war on Yemen, where Saudi Arabia, essentially the richest country in the region, is just pummeling, bombing, and starving the poorest country in the region. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with the war on Yemen, which the entire world seems to have forgotten about, if they ever even noticed to begin with?
The war in Yemen continues. It's I will borrow Western terminologies here. They call Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is the Saudi Emirati invasion of Yemen. It's going to become 8 years this month, and supported directly by the United States military and military contractors and mercenaries, and same thing with the UK, where their military and mercenary forces have been helping bombing and killing and starving and sieging Yemen. That's killed over 500,000 people already. But one of the things is that in the reporting, you notice even the United Nations has been avoiding reporting on this, because they only report the people who died from bombs, for example, but they don't report on the people who died from shortage of medicine or food, the starvation. People talk about the Holocaust. Look at the Yemeni kids. Thousands of them have died because they became skeletons, because they don't have food, and that is a direct result of the bombing and the siege. And forget the people who, because oil is not allowed, people die because they cannot get medicine, and so on. So it's still an ongoing massacre of Yemenis, and it is a greater humanitarian disaster than anywhere else, and even more than what happened on Saturday with the execution of 81 people. Yet it does not ever get the reaction, the sympathies of the same people who are crying over Ukrainian civilians. So this really shows you not hypocrisy. It's a level, I think, of bigotry toward certain skin color or certain background, if you're an Arab or Muslim, or if we benefit from selling these weapons, protecting more jobs, even among those Democrats like Chris Murphy. To him, protecting dozens of jobs is more important than stopping the murders of Yemeni people at the hand of the Saudi and these weapons that has been sold to them.
Yeah, it's I think we've heard many journalists over the last several weeks express that sentiment that you just described of there's something more upsetting and shocking about, the war in Ukraine because the victims in this case have blonde hair and blue eyes, and it's happening in civilized Europe. And of course, I'm not saying these things to sound extreme. That's actually taken from the words of actual people on our television screens.
Yeah.
So Ali, Eugene, I'm sorry if I cut you off.
No, I was just agreeing with you, and I think that it's it's obviously such a terrible state of affairs. But Ali, we really appreciate you, and thank you for coming on to help us sort through all of this, and really appreciate all the work you do. But of course, thanks for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you.
Well, really important, and I know we mentioned it at the outset, and he spoke to it, but Ali was a political prisoner there in Saudi Arabia. He was tortured. I think at one point he might have been the youngest political prisoner. I think we should have asked him, actually. I forgot that. But yeah, had the pleasure to interview him many times. But you hear voices like that. Why isn't he on CNN talking about this? Why isn't he on MSNBC? You can bring on, Michael McFaul, bringing on anti-Semitic tropes about Russia, but you don't have anyone. And, this is, and I think Ali's point was well taken. He was like, he knows the journalists. He talks to them. He sends them the information. And so it's not as if they don't have it, but people report stuff like this, I think, for the shock value and not really to make the deep connections between, Saudi Arabia, what's happening in Yemen, U.S. policy, all those other pieces. But no, I thought you hit the nail right on the head, Rania, and it's even more, pernicious to some ways recently because you saw yesterday there was a conference in Geneva to raise funds for humanitarian funds for Yemen. They were looking to raise like $4 billion odd. They did not succeed. They only raised $1.3 billion. The U.S., increased or pledged $585 million, which, might sound good. Certainly it's a lot of money to you and me, but they just gave $2.1 billion to USAID for humanitarian affairs in Ukraine.
Yeah, what does that really mean? Yeah.
Nothing close. I mean, there's, I think, 7 million people at risk of famine in Yemen. There's 20 million people who need some form of aid. There's 19 million people who need some form of food aid. I mean, there's nothing like that in Ukraine. No disrespect to Ukraine.
Almost 500,000 deaths, and those numbers don't mean anything because of who's dying. They're poor, they're brown, they don't matter. They do not matter. They don't serve the geostrategic interests of U.S. empire the way the victims of Ukraine do. It's really disgusting, in fact, and this has been going on again, as he mentioned, for the last 8 years, and it's like I've met Ali in DC before, and it's really a struggle for him to get the sort of Beltway types to care about this issue because it just doesn't serve American empire. Neither does actually feeding the war in Yemen, but that's beside the point. And what's even more outrageous about the numbers that you just threw out about the pledge of $500 million by the U.S. They couldn't even raise the $4 billion they wanted. I just want to remind people, overnight, the U.S. Congress last week approved $13.6 billion in aid to Ukraine, much of which was military aid, though they couched a lot of it in like, oh, it's humanitarian and military aid. But just like that, $13.6 billion. And then, of course, you had Joe Biden, after Zelensky spoke, pledging another $800 million like that in weapons.
You want to know what that paid for? Rania, I have a list.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
So $800 million gets you 800 Stinger missiles. That's a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. 2,000 Javelin missiles, that's an anti-tank missile, plus 1,000 light anti-armor weapons and 6,000 AT-4 anti-armor systems, another anti-tank thing. 100 tactical unmanned aerial systems, which is just a way of they sent them these Switchblade drones that are kamikaze drones. You carry them in a backpack and then you can launch them and then you use them to attack small groups of people and tanks, 100 grenade launchers, 500 rifles, 1,000 pistols, 400 machine guns, and some large number, 400 shotguns, over 20 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenade launcher and mortar rounds, 25,000 sets of body armor, and 25,000 helmets.
Jesus. So all of those weapons, this war is going to come to an end eventually.
Yeah.
But because of all the weapons that have been flooded into Ukraine, like, it's never going to end. Not only is it never going to end, like, the US sending all that weaponry to Ukraine is to kill people. Like, all of that is guaranteeing people are going to be torn apart. Both soldiers and civilians are going to be torn apart, their bodies shredded, and there's just going to be ongoing death in Ukraine by all of this insane, like, I mean, ammunition. And at the same time, it's kind of like a subsidy to the US weapons industry too. I mean, that's one of the best parts of all this for the military industrial complex is, oh, we'll just give $13.6 billion. And here's another $800 million to save Ukrainians, to help Ukrainians like impale themselves on the Russians for us. And Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all of these companies are going to benefit dramatically.
Yeah, it's going to be great if you own a restaurant in Crystal City. But, when you look at the way these companies operate, too, with their lobbying, they spread out where all the different things are built so that there's the maximum number of sort of job impacts for anyone who wants to ever, attack or critique the military-industrial complex. They've always got something in your district. I mean, I'm from, tiny little Charlottesville, Virginia, and I don't know if they still do, but at one point they were making like the key computer parts for the F-16. So, it's not known as a place that has military industrial complex, but if you were from there and tried to attack it, then all of a sudden they say, oh, what about these people with these really great jobs? And it really is pernicious the way that they use this, and I think Ali spoke to this about Chris Murphy and others who, and this honestly is the deeper history in many ways of the military-industrial complex and President Truman, who was very much in favor of the Cold War and other things like that, because corporate America was saying, well, if you just hand over all of the World War II era equipment to us companies for free, the stuff the government paid for, we're going to make a lot of stuff, but we'll also make a lot of weapons, which means you can honor your pledge for full employment. So that was a big element of what, institutionalized and ended up institutionalized the military-industrial complex in the context of the Korean War. But it's really just a disgusting situation, as you say, to see these stock prices go up basically in inverse proportion to the number, or in direct proportion, not inverse proportion, to the number of people who are dying around the world.
And it's not just that. I mean, we see the number of like Soviet era weapons, right? We see the number of weapons from the war in Bosnia that still circulate and end up killing people all over the world, wherever conflict exists. So you can imagine like the long lifetime that these weapons are going to have and just making their way around the world, killing people. It's just completely insane. And then on top of that, what's really frustrating is to continue to watch the media coverage in the US and to see the international community that says this, the international community says that. The international community, when they talk about it, literally just means the US, Europe, Australia, and Japan. I think that's pretty much in Canada. That's pretty much what they mean. They mean like North America, Australia, Europe, and Japan. That's the international community. There's an entire rest of the world out there that isn't on board with this. They're not pro-NATO. They're not in NATO. Even countries that are allied with the US. Interestingly enough, I mean, we didn't get to talk to Ali about this, but interestingly enough, even countries like Saudi Arabia aren't really taking a side here. Even client states of the US in the developing world are not taking a side here. And I'm glad that we're having this episode today because we're going to get to that. But one thing I'm excited to hear from, and I think this has kind of been a theme of something I've been doing on my show, Eugene, is talking to people who aren't like white and from the global north I mean, it's a narrative, it's a perspective that's completely missing from the coverage of this conflict.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think that there are so many sort of things that are just sort of assumptions, so-called conventional wisdom in the context of the United States that are, of course, not that in many parts of the world. I think people look at the United States and often think, wow, this is it seems just so like they're through the looking glass on their side of things, looking at the sort of nature of the discussion here, because so much just goes out of the window and so much is assumed. And I think even just sort of the overall reaction to this, sort of speaks to that in many ways, that I think a lot of people around the world look at, not that people are not sympathetic to Ukraine. I think that everyone around the world is very sympathetic to anyone who's caught in the context of a war, but there are so many other crises that don't get their just due. I mean, there's so many things that deserve this level of support, that deserve this level of coverage. So I'm not saying at all that, Ukrainian refugees, those who are being victimized by war, don't deserve, the coverage and people donating and supporting them and taking them in. But I mean, there are a lot of people who deserve that treatment, and it deserves to be put in the forefront of our discussion, and it doesn't happen. So yeah, I think I'm also glad that we're able to do this and to be able to show some of those other views. And, we're very happy to have with us now to be able to turn to India, which I think is one of the most interesting countries in terms of how this has ended up in terms of their relationship with, what's that?
And I said, and one of the largest that is not considered the international community for
right. Yeah,
but anyway.
That in and of itself does actually say quite a bit. I'm glad you actually brought that up. Wow, I had not thought about that. But either way, we are very happy to be joined here by our good friend Prasanth R, who's a journalist with the fantastic People's Dispatch and also with NewsClick, in my view, the top media source, media house, if you will, in all of India. Mm-hmm. Prasanth, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, looking at this conflict, I mean, it feels that India has honestly been one of the main countries that has been, it seems, kind of caught in a bind here. And I was wondering if you could help us understand this a bit, because, of course, I think many people know that Prime Minister Modi is, hand in glove with the United States and has been very much part of the U.S. Attempt to contain China and a number of other fronts. But here we saw India seeming, it's described as a pro-Russian position, but at least not lockstep with the United States. I mean, what does this really account for? How do we understand the shifting sands here?
Right. Thank you so much, Eugene, for that question. Very important, because I think India is one of the countries whose position has really not been understood so much, as Rania said, one of those countries not considered so much a part of the international community. A couple of things to sort of remember. I'm sorry to be the person who says we need to go back to history, but in the 50s and the 60s, India did have this policy called non-alignment, where it took this decision to not be part of the US-led bloc or the Soviet-led bloc. India did have very good relations with the Soviet Union, which were very important in building infrastructure and building defense ties. Soviet Union, long-time partner of India. But from the 90s onwards, there was a shift where India grows much more closer to the US position in a lot of issues. And this increased, greater bilateral ties, greater economic ties. There was a nuclear deal which we signed in 2008, which has caused a lot of controversy. But throughout all this period, while India's become closer to Israel, for instance, while India's political position has shifted, there's still been a very strong economic relationship with Russia. And that's, I think, one of the key things to sort of remember, the fact that despite all these strategic moves, India is now a part of the Quad, along with Japan and Australia, for instance. And, India has been sort of being positioned as a key player in the Indo-Pacific strategy, or what is being called the Indo-Pacific strategy. The United States very eager to have India as a key partner in when it tries to encircle China, for instance. But during all this, it's important to note that, like I said, there's a very strong economic relationship with Russia. And one of these things is the fact that there is in terms of defense equipment, for instance, I think around 60% of India's defense imports equipment comes from Russia. That's a big number. And if you look, for instance, at the fact that economic ties, for instance, we have oil, of course, which is a big issue, but also fertilizers. A lot of people talk about oil, but when you look at Russia's contribution to India's economy, the role of fertilizers is often not considered that seriously, but it's very massive. And India does not want to sort of face an economic crisis right now. That's the last thing this government wants. So what this has led to basically is this kind of nuanced position, so to speak, where in various votes, for instance, it has refused to take a stance. We know about the vote in the UN General Assembly, but there have been other procedural votes in the Security Council, one at the IAEA also, where it has refused to condemn the Russian position. So right now, India playing a very delicate maneuvering game. On the one hand, it has its largest strategic interests, which are very much more closely tied to the United States. On the other hand, there are immediate geopolitical and economic interests, which are closely tied to Russia. So the last time India was given this choice was, or so-called choice, was with Iran, where India was a major importer of Iranian oil, and the United States basically said that I either cut off those imports, or you're going to come under the sanctions regime, and India complied. This time, it has refused to do so. In fact, there have been further oil purchases since the war began, and there is a lot of speculation about a major deal that is going to be struck with Russia right now. So that's where we are at as far as the relations are concerned.
It's so interesting because that really is, I think, emblematic of what so many countries, I think, in the global south are trying to balance right now, even if they're very close allies with the US, because it demonstrates that Russia is a global power in some way. And it does speak to some, a theme that we've been talking about a lot on Breakthrough News in various ways, and that's the issue of like rising multipolarity. And I'm curious if, where China fits in here, because of course, India and China have had a bit of a tense relationship recently. But, taking a stand like this kind of puts China maybe not in the same position as, or India, maybe not in the same position as China, but it's not in the US orbit on this. Do you think that
Exactly.
this might bring China and India maybe closer together? Or I don't know, maybe it's the opposite. Is there a risk of war between them, given what we've seen taking place the last couple of years?
Right. Actually, the recent crisis was kind of noteworthy because it was one of those issues where India, Pakistan, and China all took a very similar position, and a lot of people pointed out that the irony of that, so to speak. But actually, there's going to be a lot of diplomacy in the coming week or two, which is very interesting because on the one hand, this week we have the Japanese Prime Minister visiting New Delhi. I believe on Monday or something, the Australian Prime Minister and Narendra Modi are having a summit meeting via teleconference. Victoria Nuland, incidentally, is coming to Delhi next week as well. Good question. But yeah, amid all this, we also have Wang Yi,
Our
the Foreign Minister of
apologies.
China. If you start making counts like that, that's a different question. But yes, in between all this, we also have Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, coming to India as well towards the end of the month. The last few days, it has been confirmed. And now this is a very interesting, development that has taken place because, like you said, since 2020, especially, things have been very tense with China. There have been talks. There have been a couple of military incidents as well. There have been talks. They're not really worked out. So at this point, the opposition, for instance, has been attacking the government on this. So at this point of time, Wang Yi coming is a very interesting move because it does signal the possibility of a much talks at a much higher level. And it's also important to note that Afghanistan provided another moment where some of these possibilities, there was an attempt to explore some of these possibilities because once the Americans withdrew, we had India, Pakistan, China, the Central Asian countries, all of them, Russia, all of them in a very similar bind on what to do there. And there were some attempts at engagement here and there, although it did not really sort of take off as much as many observers had hoped, because they had hoped for a new regional sort of alliance, not alliance per se, no regional engagement with Afghanistan in this issue. But the key question, if you ask about what might happen right now, I think it's a bit too early to say, because on the one hand, it is clear that India is committed to the Quad. There's no denying that. And whenever the Quad has talked about the Indo-Pacific, for instance, India has very much been on board. They're very happy to be part of all those pronouncements and declarations, so to speak. So we are not seeing any reduction in those kind of temperatures at all. So this issue is so I would say that a large part of this really depends on what happens with regard to the war itself in the coming months and maybe even years, because many experts have talked about the possibility of decoupling, right? In the sense that, are we seeing the possibility of Russia and China sort of consciously taking an effort to, say, decouple themselves from the Western Bloc as much as possible, in which case countries like India have a huge choice to make, because they really can't, it's going to be a very difficult choice for them, in which case we might see further engagement with China on some of these issues. On the other hand, if this is not going to perhaps take, if that decoupling does not take place to that extent, if it's in some senses, if it is resolved relatively faster, we might see India going back much more quickly and easily to some of its earlier positions as far as China is concerned.
Mm-hmm. One other issue I'm curious about is, if there is the climate of Russophobia at all, or to any degree like this. I mean, as you know very well, Prasanth, obviously the overhang from the Cold War, it's like, anti-Russia, everything is so easy to do. But, I notice when I look even at like mainstream media in India, I'll see reports on Donbass and things like that. So I'm curious, what the climate is there, sort of the man on the street, person on the street, if you will, in terms of how they're kind of viewing this and the broader demonization around Russia.
That's a very interesting question, Eugene, because there have been some very strange bedfellows in recent times, so to speak, when it comes to these issues. Because, for instance, on the one hand, a couple of things. First of all, especially under this government, foreign policy has been very, very closely associated with domestic policy. So, there is the Indian government never loses a chance to portray anything related to what's happening abroad to its own achievements, so to speak, achievements. In fact, there was a bit of a controversy over Indian students in Ukraine when the issue first broke out over the evacuation. Many experts did say that the Indian government was not quick enough. The Indian government, of course, had its own narrative. It was used during elections. People did hear about, Narendra Modi did well in Ukraine, etc., etc. But keeping that aside, so one interesting thing we do see is that even the right-wing media in India, which is a lot of the television media, the big channels, very, very right-wing, they have actually taken a far less pro-US position than you would often expect in such situations. And even if you look at what is the centrist media, there is there's a lot of talk about what are the strategic lessons India can learn from this kind of a situation. How should India position itself between these two players? So you don't see as much of the pro-US sort of rhetoric that you see in many other countries maybe on this issue. Part of this is, of course, due to the fact that India has a very long relationship with Russia, like I said, with the Soviet Union before and even with Russia. So there's a bit of, memories of that, nostalgia of that, for instance, to some extent. Part of that is because many of these commentators are very clued in about the economic relationship and that it doesn't make sense to really sort of just jump into that bandwagon and say that anything, you cancel out anybody or anything Russian. So that's part of it. And I think even if you look, for instance, at the broad number of people on the street, there is, of course, a lot of people who consume, media from the West, especially media from the United States and the United Kingdom. So there is there is a lot of that sentiment. I'm not going to deny that. But at the same time, I think that that narrative has not really sort of been as successful, say, in a country like India. And I think it could be true of many countries in the global south as well. There is always a little bit more, while there's a lot of general admiration for the United States about many things, many of which might be truly unwarranted, but nonetheless, the fact remains that, in this matter, it's a bit, I don't think really the narrative has completely worked so much. People are a bit more inclined to say that, well, take a sort of what is called a realist foreign policy position in some senses, even when you have ordinary discussions, so to speak.
And on that note, I'm curious, given how there's so much of the world that does import a lot of commodities from Russia, particularly when it comes to fertilizer and wheat, oil and gas. Does India stand to be affected by the imposition of these sanctions by basically the entire West, or is there a get around for India?
Right. So I think ultimately it boils down to the question. Oil, like I said, is a key question. The question of chemicals, fertilizers, all of these. So there is the possibility of a rise of prices. Inflation is already kind of rising in India. So this is a very bad time for these kind of issues as far as this government is concerned. We have an election coming up in 2024. So general discontent is the last thing the government right now wants to sort of deal with. So I think as far as the Indian government is concerned, they're going to be trying to do everything possible to sort of see how many waivers they can get on this issue as far as it's concerned. But just because you pointed out that, Rani, I just wanted to also add that one of the things, especially NewsClick, we have been sort of writing about is the fact that for many countries like India, this is a larger existential question as well in terms of what do you do when your dollar reserves are so vulnerable to being expropriated, to being seized at any point of time. It was, you could always sort of say that, okay, these are small countries like Iran or Venezuela and sort of pretend, say for many Indians or Indian policymakers pretend they didn't exist. Iran was bad enough, but when it comes to Russia, now it's a larger question that, what happens, say 5 or 7 years down the line, where can you be affected by these sanctions itself? Can India be affected by these sanctions itself? And I think these are questions that many more people are beginning to ask. Now it's really a fork on the road. There are two real ways you can go from here. One is to sort of decide that, all right, you should sort of, start thinking of alternative infrastructures, start working with other countries who are in a position to provide these alternative infrastructures. And for that reason, try to resolve some of the geopolitical issues that you're facing right now, because India is in a very bad position in terms of its neighborhood. On the other hand, you can equally decide that the simplest thing is just to completely toe the US line, if not now, in a couple of years, and then be safe, so to speak, from sanctions, whatever pain it might bring. So that way, I guess this crisis is a big, it's a big question for Indian policymakers, because as such a large player, and with so much of imports, especially in terms of raw materials, these are really the big challenges right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Prasanth, as always, really appreciate you being willing to join us. I think People's Dispatch is covering this from so many angles, and NewsClick doing a fantastic job covering all things happening there on the subcontinent. So thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much, Eugene and Rania.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is one that
was
I'm watching very closely. Definitely NewsClick it's English and Hindi, and I think they have some Urdu content too, but it's a good place to follow if you want to follow anything happening on India. By far the most coverage of the farmers' protests, which I think deserves to be said, and they've certainly caught some opprobrium because of that from the worst, maybe the best enemies to have. But yeah, great stuff. And People's Dispatch has a fantastic article up about what you were saying there at the end, Rania, the impact on developing nations of these sanctions and some of the challenges that are going to be presented, which I think is, really tricky.
Hey, the price of fuel for the generator in my building has already gone up by like a third.
Wow.
And it's because of this. It's because of the speculation on the oil prices, basically. It's pretty insane. Yeah,
it is.
So that's just the beginning. Just the beginning.
Well, now we want to turn to another guest we're very honored to have with us, Mustafa Fetouri, who's a Libyan analyst and an award-winning journalist. Mr. Fetouri, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Oh, you might be muted. I think you are muted. Can you unmute? Oh, we got. What did you call it? Technological gremlins?
Yeah.
They've come back, Eugene.
Maybe it's our side. We're just going to check on this. I think it might be on your end. We're not 100% sure. Okay, well, we're going to see if
while
we can figure this out. Please go ahead.
Yeah, while we figure that out, it's a good time to remind people that you can support Breakthrough News and all of our excellent content here, including Eugene's The Punch Out, the Socialist Program, which Eugene's been on so much lately. Excellent content. My program, Dispatches, and so much more. You can support our work by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. I highly recommend doing it. Yes. It's a good idea. You should become a patron at Breakthrough News. And if you're watching this live, you can always throw money into the super chat, which we forgot to mention at the beginning of the show, by the way. And if we get to it, we don't always get to it, but if we get to it and I decide it's worth it, we may read your comment on air. But
talking about censorship.
Not guaranteed. Talking about censorship.
It's there's so much here. There's conversation in Congress today, by the way, about whether or not the U.S. is going to promote these jet fighters for Ukraine and some of the issues surrounding that. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue of the Socialist Program, because this was what we were talking about yesterday, myself and Brian, was sort of how it feels the conflict is at such an inflection point where it really could go either way. And on the one hand, you've got certainly an outline of the possibility of a path to peace, but on the other hand, you just have, a huge amount of gasoline being poured on the fire. And as I said on Socialist Program, I don't know if some of these people think they can actually win and Ukraine can beat Russia, or if they just want to hurt Russia more and kind of fight to the last Ukrainian. But it just feels that the nature of this escalation and all of these arms and troops is just going to harden both sides of the conflict. It's not going to lead us. It's doubling down on the exact thing that got us here.
Oh, 100%. No, I mean, I'm still in the middle of watching the socialist program from yesterday, and it's excellent. And people after this live stream should go watch it. But no, you made some really excellent points about that in particular, about the fact that this war didn't even have to happen in the first place. It could have been prevented. And I mean, Eugene, made an excellent point in the sense that now you actually do see the West saying, "Oh yeah, Ukraine was never going to join NATO. That was never going to happen." But it's like, but
Well, I
why
think we
couldn't
have
you
our
just say
guest
that?
back.
Oh, well,
Hopefully,
we'll
Mr.
get back to
Mustafa
this later.
Fetouri here, who's a Libyan analyst and journalist. Mr. Fetouri, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And, I mean, there's so many things I want to ask and say, but, one of the things that has really stood out to me the most in the whole conversation around Ukraine has been the conversation about NATO is only a defensive alliance. It's just to protect Western Europe. It's, never done anything wrong. But your country of Libya was, of course, brutally bombed by NATO. And I just wonder how some of this conversation is striking you, having had your own nation go through an offensive war by NATO.
Well, it comes true as a total hypocrisy in the part of the West, unfortunately, and they are telling something and they are doing something different. The experience of Libya, my country, as you mentioned in 2011, is still fresh in mind. And if we take just one aspect of it, that is the aspect of the refugees, for example, and compare how refugees are coming out of Ukraine nowadays are being received in Western Europe and the United States as well. And back then in 2011, how refugees were received. Actually, nobody welcomed anybody out of Libya, totally, completely, because most of the refugees who wanted to flee the country at the time were not Libyans. But some Libyans did flee the country for security reasons. And I am one of those persons who fled Libya back then at the end of the war, actually, but because of the security situation in the country has deteriorated so badly, I had to seek refuge for my family, really, not for myself, in Europe. But it was quite a hard time for me to gain the legal status. I did not come I did not come to Europe for being poor or being, unable to provide for my family. Not at all. I'm quite a qualified person. I work. I have, I left my job in Libya, but I came for security reasons. And then, there's different categories for refugee status according to international law and the United Nations as well. And one of those categories is seeking protection. So I came to Europe seeking protection. I did not want any money. I did not want any help. Yet I had a very hard time. I had to spend the first 2 years like any other illegal immigrants, despite the fact that I have my own means and I am not in need of any financial help in that sense. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it, which is comparable also to what is happening in Ukraine, is the fact that NATO has always claimed back then that it intervened in Libya to protect civilians and to stop the regime killing the civilian population in Libya. That was completely untrue. It was a big lie, and still today a big lie. We discovered at the time, we found out actually, and later years has been confirmed by different documents and different former officials who spoke about what happened in 2011 in Libya, that it was about regime change. It was not about democracy or protecting the civilians, because the killing of civilians and, of course, the violation of human rights still continues today in Libya. But because the regime in Libya nowadays is pro-Western, is actually helped by NATO and the United States, they don't say much about it. They don't talk about it. And in the same context, NATO always said it's a defensive alliance protecting democracy and freedom of choice for its members. Well, what it has been doing over the last 2 decades when it comes to Europe and expanding eastwards closer to the Russian border does not, comply or does not actually profess to the claims being made by NATO. What we are seeing today is actually in the Ukraine context. I think it's much more about Ukraine. It's actually and principally between the United States and the NATO alliance, of course, and Russia. And why should Russia keep quiet when NATO forces are close to its own door? Why should they sit there? Plus the fact, well, we always have to remember that war is evil wherever it is. We have experienced war almost, for the last 30 years in the Middle East and North Africa in one way or the other. And then, but there are facts that you cannot just overlook when it comes to the current situation in Ukraine. Ukraine has always, joining NATO, has always been a problem for the Russians. And the Russians, rightly, have their own legitimate security concerns when it comes to NATO getting closer to their borders. Yes, please.
I'm curious about, when we look at what's happening in Ukraine, we see a lot of the European countries, the NATO countries saying that we have to protect Ukraine to protect freedom and democracy and Western values. But in fact, Ukraine is actually one of the most, I think the most corrupt country in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. It was ranked that way. Also, the leadership there, Volodymyr Zelensky, the hero of the world right now, wasn't exactly the most democratic person. He was getting rid of opposition media, getting rid of opponents. And so with that in mind, I want to go back to Libya for a moment, because what we heard from the European countries like France and the UK, as well as the US, back in 2011 is that we had to do a no-fly zone. We have to do a no-fly zone in Libya to protect freedom and democracy from this evil dictator. Obviously, we look at Libya now, and it's not a free and democratic place. There's a lot of chaos. There's different, warlords controlling this or that territory. So I'm curious, from your perspective, why did some European countries like France and the UK seem so eager to overthrow Gaddafi? Because obviously, it wasn't for democracy and freedom.
No, not at all. It had nothing to do with democracy. It had nothing to do with freedom. It had nothing to do with the protection of the Libyan civilians who were supposedly, as claimed by Western media, taking to the streets in mass numbers, to protest against Gaddafi. That was not true. But I can tell you 3 reasons why the United States, NATO countries, as well as some regional powers like Turkey wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. First of all, you have to look at the map of Africa in relation to the rest of the world, especially Europe, and you will see Libya is in the middle of the African coast and the Mediterranean Sea, very, very close to Europe, and it's a connection point between southwest and east, of course, the Middle East. Second of all, Libya is a top producer of oil in the world and has the 3rd largest reserves in the world. Not yet exploited, about 48 billion barrels, not yet touched. And of course, 40 years of Gaddafi has been a hell for the West, whether it comes to the Palestinian issue or it comes to the African resistance to the colonial powers like Portugal, like the apartheid system in South Africa, like Namibia, like Zimbabwe, like Zambia, like you name it. Gaddafi has always been supporter of those liberation movements. He has been supporting for the Palestinian cause, for example, ever since he came to power. So plus another dimension to the Libyan-African relationship that irritated the French so much that it irritated Mr. Sarkozy, who was president of France in 2011, to take the decision that Gaddafi should go, is the fact that Gaddafi was the initiator, actually, of the African Union. Don't forget that the African Union was announced in Libya. It started in 1999, in September the 9th, 1999, in Libya, and transforming the former African Organization for African Unity into the African Union. And Gaddafi had a bigger proposal whereby Africa should have its own currency backed by Libyan finances in the form of a Libyan golden dinar, instead of using the franc CFA, which is backed by the French central bank, and the Bank of France decides what and how much money each of these countries, especially in Western Africa, can spend. So because of that vision, it was a direct threat to the former colonial power, in this case of France. So they had to decide to get rid of the guy, despite the fact that the UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which vaguely authorized the use of force in Libya, did not call for regime change. It actually provided the legal status, if you like, by their own standards, to protect the civilians inside Libya, not to change the regime. But they even went a step further than changing the regime of Gaddafi by helping him kill. They got him, seized outside his hometown on 20th of October 2011, and they gave the coordinates where he is to the rebels in the ground who were supporting them, and they murdered them in broad daylight without any questions. Yes, please.
It's really amazing to see all of these various, hypocrisies on so many levels. And I think the role of NATO and all of this. And I really appreciate you, Mr. Fetouri, being willing to come on and help us sort through it and give us some of your perspective on what's happening here. I know you have a lot going on, so thanks for giving us some of your time on the freedom side.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Amazing. We haven't heard from more people who've been saved by NATO.
Again,
I don't think I've seen a single.
Why is he not on CNN? Why is he not on MSNBC?
Why not? Right?
I mean, even if you have a totally different set of views, just the fact that the different views we've heard on some of these conflicts over the course of all the shows we've done on Ukraine from all around the world, including, by the way, from Russia and Ukraine, just never make it into the conversation. I think tells you everything you know about what the goals of mainstream media is. If you want to inform people, you have all sides. If you want to propagandize people, you just have one side to see it. So yeah, really, really important, indeed. I think. And, some of us who can remember what happened then in Libya and what's happening there now, just tragic on so many levels. And before we move on, it just has to be said that in the wake of that, the way Europe has turned the Mediterranean into a graveyard for immigrants is just, criminal. And, you'd like to see the treatment being given to Ukrainian refugees who, again, deserve to be treated very well and taken care of very well. Like to see that for people coming from Africa and the Middle East because they're being so brutalized and demonized there.
It is incredible that after the US and Europe dismantled the Libyan state under the guise of protecting protesters and freedom and democracy, Libya went on to have open air slave markets. Yep. Libya was one of the most prosperous, if not the most prosperous countries in Northern Africa. To go from that to what it is today, and for nobody to say a word about it, oops, we just literally just swept it under the rug.
Yeah,
it's criminal on so many levels.
It is
completely criminal.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just reiterating it's criminal. I don't know what else to say. It's
Well, I'll remind people to make sure you sign up for our Telegram, where we continue to talk about many things. Also, Ukraine, we're going to continue talking about it. Make sure you hit subscribe, hit that bell, sign up for our Telegram. We're going to be putting out stuff about all sorts of issues, but we're going to continue to try to be your source for, a wide range of views on what's going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and the impact of sanctions. Which we've just seen there.
There you go.
Rania Khaled
live
losing her
for everyone
electricity.
to see.
Yeah, live and in the flesh. This is the nature of it. I mean, we're joking about it, but it is true.
No. What are you going to do?
Economic wars that are waged against these countries. Continue to resist. That's what you're going to do, Rania.
Right.
Nevertheless, we want to turn the page here to a very important issue here domestically, and that is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the teachers are on strike. I believe this is the second week of the strike, but we'll find out if I'm wrong about that. Very happy to be joined by Kristen Melby, who is a teacher in Minneapolis, been with the Minneapolis Public Schools for 15 years, an elementary environmental educator. Kristen, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah,
Well,
we are. You were right. We're in week 2.
We're in week 2. Okay, good. I'm glad I was right about that. Trying to follow it as closely as possible. We're honored to have you here. I mean, I've seen you guys singing Purple Rain. You've had a lot of big demonstrations. But for those who haven't seen, give us the context of why you all went out to the picket line.
Yeah, so we've been in negotiations for 13 months, and the district has maintained that the status quo is fine for students and staff, and we overwhelmingly say no. You know, we had a historic strike vote. 97% of teachers voted to go on strike. 98% of ESPs, which are our support staff in our buildings that keep our buildings running, voted to go on strike. So no one here is going to settle for the status quo. I think after the pandemic, we saw that schools are essential. If people didn't know that before, they should know that now. And the district continues to refuse to let us even come to the table to be part of decision making. And I see these pictures right now of the strike band. Like, I think you see on the streets right now joy in our resistance, because there's been so much repression for so long that people are feeling just like this is such a righteous struggle, and we are finding joy in it, even in the fact that this is difficult. You know, it's difficult to be away from our students after all these months through the pandemic, but we know that it's the right work to do right now.
You know, I'm glad you said that, because it really does feel like we're at a critically important inflection point when we talk about public education. I mean, we've seen so many teachers, you know, have been leaving the profession because it's just so difficult with all these challenges. And I'm curious your thoughts about this. I mean, it feels like if there was ever a time, it's probably always a time for this, that if we don't invest in public education now, the impacts of this are going to be catastrophic on our young people over the next, decade or so.
Yeah, I would say, the comparison to sort of our healthcare system, right? Like, if we didn't figure that out during a pandemic, that we need to invest because we all do better when we're all doing better, then what will it take, right? I feel like we had the opportunity in Minneapolis to do things right when we came back from our distance learning. We could have kept our class sizes small to meet the mental health challenges of students. We could have kept them small and brought in more support staff to make sure that those students who struggled with learning from different spaces got their needs met, and we didn't do that. And part of why we didn't do that is because the imbalance of power between the district and educators and communities is completely out of whack, right? We were never brought into the conversations of how and when and in what nuanced ways to bring students back into buildings and what kind of supports they needed. The community wasn't invited into that, and we weren't invited into that. And so mistake after mistake after mistake was made. And so you see not only educators leaving, but students leaving. And if educators and families were at the table, I think we would have had a really different outcome. I'm a parent. I have an 8-year-old in the district as well. No, sorry. I just want to say, please. I live that experience from both angles, right? And I am committed to public education, not only for my own child, but for everyone's children. And the district has to be forced to do better.
That's
Sorry,
interesting,
go ahead.
actually, an interesting, no, please. It's an interesting dynamic, actually, because so often the narrative that's promoted, particularly in the mainstream press, and then of course by the anti-union types, is teachers and parents are opposed to each other. So we often do forget a lot of teachers actually are parents. But that said, can you tell us a little bit about what the strikers are demanding? What are some of the basic demands that you're asking for?
Yeah, so we're kind of fighting under a banner of safe and stable schools. And what that means is we need smaller class sizes. So we need caps. The district can say, okay, sure, we'll give you small class sizes. But unless we get something in the contract that says this is the cap, we know that that can turn, like in some rooms, like 45. You know, there's first grade classrooms with 35 students. And these are first graders who maybe only stepped in the building for the first time this year, right? They might have spent their entire kindergarten in like learning online. So in addition to smaller class sizes, we're asking for mental health supports. Right now, the ratio to social workers to students is 1 to 1,000. You can imagine how effective that is. So we want like ratios that more reflect the needs of what our students have. We want a competitive and livable wage for our education support professionals. Most folks are earning about $24,000 a year, which means many of them are working 2 and 3 jobs, right? Aren't able to make rent. And these are some of the folks that do, I would say, the hardest work in our buildings, right? They're the support staff who work with children with special needs, right? There are bilingual assistants who help interpret for families who speak multiple languages, right? And they're also the ones who were put back into buildings first before anyone was vaccinated and to work with kids, right? So these folks have historically and continue to dedicate themselves to the well-being of kids and are not treated with respect from the district or compensated in a way that they can even like live off of. So, I mean, I feel like our demands, and I just feel like it's really important to say, like, we're not asking for anything that's outrageous, right? Like, we're asking for class sizes that are manageable, mental health for students, and a living and dignified, like, working conditions for the people who work with kids.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's such an important point because it's sort of like, you know, if you stop anyone on the street, probably even a lot of these politicians, and just ask them, oh, should we have small class sizes? Yes. Should we support students with mental health? Yes. Like the type of things that almost everyone recognizes has to happen if we're going to have good public schools, which brings me to my next question because, you know, I saw an amazing video of 2 of your officers giving an update on what was going on. But the thing that caught me, I sent it to a lot of my teacher friends, is as the video goes on, the number of people honking in support of the picket line just as like it becomes more and more prominent, and it felt like every car by the end. So what kind of support are you all seeing from the community there in Minneapolis?
Yeah, it's on fire. I mean, the love is everywhere. You know, every morning we're at our sites and people are dropping us off more food and more donations than we even know what to do with. People are honking. You know, I live 10 blocks from where I work. And so I took my son on a bike ride after one of the pickets, and I had 3 families who stopped me and they said, we will keep our kids home as long as it takes to get what students and staff deserve. I mean, I feel like it is unbelievable, the level of support. And Minneapolis has been through a lot, like for the last couple of years, you know, like it is a city that has had to wrestle and continues to wrestle with a lot of deep issues around racial justice, around police violence. And you know, in addition to all the inequities that were exacerbated by the pandemic, right? And in that, you see mutual aid like systems set up all over the place, and folks are coming out and saying like, you know, we are going to do whatever it takes to hold the line, like whatever it takes. And families and community members are helping us do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly been fantastic to see. I mean, you've had a number of huge marches. I mean, just massive marches through downtown Minneapolis. So if you could just talk a little bit about sort of the broader, I mean, you talk about this joy and resistance, but the broader sort of community that seems to be being created out there on the line and out there in the streets, because it really does seem powerful, even seeing it through a screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, all this creativity that has been like, I don't know, repressed or held down by these systems is really just like exploded into the streets. And we have children and we have high school students playing in our strike band, and we have St. Paul educators who are coming across the river, and they are taking days off work to come and support us and let us know that our fight is their fight. And I just think every single day we're seeing more of that. People are singing in the streets. And I think that's like what, like we're channeling that rage into this expression of like joyous resistance, and that like you can't contain that, so the district is starting, like we're seeing cracks in our negotiations. We've had some folks step down even in the last 24 hours, which shows that like they get the power out there on the streets. And each day, like, it didn't matter last week. It was -10 and it was snowing in Minnesota, and it didn't affect the numbers on our lines. People were still out there and, solid in what we're doing.
I'm curious, like, what can people do to follow the strike? Where can they support it if they want to support it, or to just follow along and see how things are going?
Yeah, so MFT has a Facebook page and a website, but we've also created another webpage called safeandstableschools.org, where you can find the most up-to-date information on there. And we will take all sorts of signs of solidarity, signs like reaching out, and also like financial support is also key, because lots of our members were struggling before we went on strike, right? And so now it's day 8. Of no work. And so any sort of support that can come in, we will make sure gets to the folks that need it.
Well, Kristen, we really appreciate you being willing to come on. Just a fantastic fight that you all are waging out there for students in Minneapolis. And I think it's a great example for people all around the country. So I know you got a lot going on, but thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much. We're heading back to the streets at 4:00 tonight. So
right on.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, Rania, I have to say -10. Woo.
Not just -10. I was just thinking about what she said about there's people making $24,000 a year as a teacher. And that's a really shocking number, because in the US, I know the poverty line for a single person is like $12,000, which makes no sense to me, by the way, because I don't know how you can afford to pay more than your rent with $12,000 a year and buy some food if you're lucky. But for a family of 4, the $26,000 a year is actually considered below the poverty line. So technically, if you've got a single provider for a family of 4 who's a teacher in Minneapolis making $24,000 a year, that's a poverty wage.
It really is. And tell me, I've been to Minneapolis, and the cost of living there is not that cheap. So that's a criminal level. I agree with you. I mean, I had seen someone talking about they're making $35,000 the other day as a teacher, and I was like blown away that was incredibly
That's not
low.
enough.
I mean, you know, I know non-union places paying starting teachers more than that. So yeah, I mean, I think the fact that the city and the state have been able to get away with this, well, really the city, but the states are always complicit too to some degree on education, is really amazing. But it is amazing to see. I encourage people to go, certainly go to safeandstableschools.org, find out what you can do to support. Check out what they're doing on social media. I mean, they're doing these huge marches. They're getting a ton of community support. And I think, partially because it's in the Midwest, partially because it's Minneapolis, not necessarily getting the same level. Well, I guess I shouldn't say the Midwest does get, but you know what I'm saying? It's not one of these like American cities that's always on the front page of the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times kind of thing. And I know there's a lot of news going on out there, but I really think that this is an important struggle, because as we've shown on this show, I mean, we talked to people from San Francisco, we've talked to teachers from Chicago. I mean, these are really the same issues all over the country, where public education, which seems like such a basic thing, I think, to a lot of us, Rania, here in the U.S., because, we all went to K through 12 education. I mean, it really is under attack. It really is under assault. And the pandemic is being used as cover to further go after it. And we know what's going to happen. What they're trying to do is drive the conditions down so they can privatize the schools and hand them over to charter schools that don't have any unions.
Same script we've been seeing for the last several decades. And, Eugene, I think that, one thing that the teachers should try doing that they haven't tried doing, if they do want to raise those funds, is perhaps they should rename themselves like Ukrainian fighters for justice or something. Because I'm joking. And not to make light of everything, but you can't help, it's almost comical. If it wasn't so tragic, it's comical. The degree to which there's always billions and billions, like an endless supply. There's no limit on the amount of money that the US government is willing to bipartisan overnight approve for buying more weapons to fuel a conflict, but we can't pay teachers a living wage. Like, it's completely outrageous.
You know, it really is completely outrageous, and I mean, these are some of the things that you were pointing out that were denied in Congress last year. I mean, you know, the Build Back Better plan, whatever negative things you could say about it, didn't go far enough, so on and so forth. Big investments in pre-K, big investments to help retain teachers, paid family leave, more money for healthy school meals, the child tax credit, which is, you know, good for families, and anything that's good for families is usually going to be good for schools, because the reality is our schools are basically a triage center for our communities. And so when families are struggling, the schools are having to deal with all of the fallout of that. I mean, it's really amazing the type of things that teachers have to deal with on an everyday basis. So, you know, the investment of billions of dollars into public education was something that was on the table in this country, that it was one of the pieces that could have come forward, and we were not able to do it because of the greed of these corporate individuals. I mean, I call it the corporate caucus in Congress that is then willing to give unlimited money to weapons. I mean, obviously humanitarian aid is a different thing, but really massive funds. And just on top of all that, almost certainly they're going to get the $800 billion for the Pentagon this year, the most ever, on the back of what's happening in Ukraine. And it's like, if you said, let's spend $800 billion on education, you know, Congress
People
would shut
think
down.
you were insane.
Yeah.
No, they would think you were insane. There'd be talks about death panels on like Fox News and maybe even MSNBC. But, you know, you mentioned the child tax credit, and I just want to note that the monthly child poverty rate in the United States increased from 12.1% in December 2021 to 17% in January 2022. And that is because of the failure to, or the expiration and then the failure to renew the monthly child tax credit payments that had gone into effect because of COVID. And so 3.7 million more children were in poverty that didn't have to be. I mean, no children in the US, by the way, have to be in poverty.
Sure.
But 3.7 million more were shoved into poverty in January of this year because of getting rid of that monthly child tax credit. I'm not sure how much is the tax credit. It's like $250 per child or something.
Well, it's up to $8,000 a year, depending. So the average person is getting like a few $100s per
month.
Family. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not even that much money. Like, if you think about what that means, it's like a few $1,000s at most for a family over the course of a year.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not mistaken, if that's a tax, like, I mean, if that's a tax credit, it just means something that you're not paying in taxes. So it's not
so
like
what it is
it's not a giveaway.
Yeah. Well, it's a refundable credit, basically. So essentially, the way it used to work prior to the expansion was that you got the money back off your taxes, but the way this works is it essentially pays you the money that you would get back month to month, so that it's essentially it's up to $8,000 that you don't pay in taxes, essentially, that you would get back. And so it's more complicated than that in some ways. But
my point is, it's not even like the government having to come up with more money. But the point is, of course, it's like that can go. Children in America don't matter, but weapons to Ukraine matter. So, anyways,
indeed,
I think the point is.
Well, we're gonna turn the page here again to another critical issue. That's the issue of student debt. I'm sure that's an issue it's certainly an issue I'm dealing with. I can tell you this. I don't know about your personal finances.
Here.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. We are very, very honored to have with us here India Walton, who is the Senior Strategic Organizer for Roots Action, and obviously world famous socialist mayoral candidate in Buffalo. Shocked the world, inspired us all. India Walton, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk about this very important issue.
You know, it's a critically important issue. I have to say, I paid my student loans like 2 days ago. And even though I do it every month, and I've done it every month for over a decade now, it's still like the biggest sticker shock. And I always am thinking, I can't believe I'm doing this. But, you know, it help us frame this issue. I mean, how much student debt is out there? How bad is it for people? I mean, there's sort of a perception that it's not that big of a deal promoted by some of those who say we shouldn't get rid of it.
Right. So there are more than 45 million Americans with student debt. The student debt burden right now as a nation we carry is about $1.7 trillion. But I think
Wow.
the most astonishing part about that, as we leave Black History Month and enter into Women's History Month, is the way it disproportionately impacts women, the way student debt disproportionately impacts people of color, and the way it disproportionately impacts poor people. It's disheartening that we are now a year into the Biden administration and we've not seen any of the promises that he campaigned on delivered.
Tell us, for people like me and Eugene, who are still having to pay student debt into our 30s, which I cannot tell you. I mean, anybody who has student debt, it's like so frustrating for obvious reasons. But what could be done? Because oftentimes we'll hear from politicians that like they can't do anything about it, even if they made campaign promises. Like, you get the idea that it's just not possible. Is that true? Or is there something that could be done to get rid of this
Yeah.
debt? And if so, what is it? What could be done?
So Roots Action is partnering with the debtors union. And we know that the Higher Education Act of 1965 gives the president certain executive powers. So by executive order, President Biden could wipe it out right now, today. Could have done it a year ago, should have done it a year ago. So we're heading down to DC on April 4th to push the issue, right? We're looking at repayments resuming May 1st, and it's going to be a burden on a lot of working class people who, frankly, I think that for a lot of us, we're sold a lie. We were told that if you work hard and go to college, that you'll get a good job with a good wage. And we're seeing people that are strapped with tens of thousands of dollars in student debt, and employers are not matching the promise that we were sold. So it's time for us to have a reset, to cancel student debt and make higher education free. In a world with so much information flying around, it doesn't make any sense that folks are having to have the burden of debt to pay for what is widely available.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I want to ask is, I'm always so shocked when I hear this, but it's one of the big things, is there's a whole line of argument that we shouldn't cancel student debt because somehow canceling student debt is racist and will be worse for Black people who have borrowed money, and thus it's just giving money away to rich white people at the expense of Black people. Now, that sounds wrong to me, but I hear it so much. I'm hoping you could, debunk it or not, I guess.
It is wrong. I think it's a straw man defense, right? Because rich white people who have money for college don't generally take on student debt to pay for college. Right. Their parents pay for it for them. And I know that if I had $75,000 less in student debt, it would free me up to do things like pursue purchasing a home, provide resources to put my children in extracurricular activities, right? So to some people, $500 a month, I heard the previous conversation about the advanced child tax credit. To some folks, $250 or $500 a month is not a lot of money, but for the majority of us, it's a significant amount of money that is better spent on other things, right? People are waiting and withholding marriage, having children, making career changes, going back to school, opening businesses, because they have to worry about student debt first. And it's just a ridiculous notion that in a place like the United States of America, there are people who are being prevented from upward social mobility because they're paying this extractive education system.
India, there's another aspect of this that's like so outrageous. I remember a couple of years ago when I was doing a segment on student loan debt, I was so stunned by the numbers about elderly people who are not only dealing with the payment of student loan debt, they are actually, the US government garnishes part of their Social Security payments if they're defaulting on their loans. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of it? I know it's not as many people. I think it's something like around 3 million Americans that are stuck with student debt who are like over the age of 60. I don't know if that number is still accurate. It was a few years ago. But what's going on there? What's going on with the issue of elderly people who are even having Social Security taken from them over this?
Well, first of all, one person who is having their Social Security, their already limited income garnished to repay student loans is ridiculous. I mean, the notion is just inhumane. And, it's the loan servicing, right? That's the most disgusting part, right? Is that you take out these loans, you after 20 years for some folks, they still have not even paid down any significant percentage of the principal on the loan. It's just a
Because of
really
interest. Yeah.
exploitive and extractive practice. And I think that, folks of any age, but I think that the fact that it's being branded as sort of a millennial issue, right, is another way to keep us divided enough to not have the political will to make this thing happen. And I just dream about the day that student debt is canceled in this utopian society we're going to live in, when folks are actually like going out to dinner and supporting local businesses instead of large corporations that use our student loan repayments for naming rights on large stadiums and
Right.
such.
I'm actually really glad you brought
go
that
ahead.
up. No, I was gonna say, I'm really glad you brought that up because, this is the United States. So anything that it seems like it should logically happen and it's not, it means someone's probably making money off of it. I mean, who is getting paid off of this? Because I keep thinking, like, what is going on that we can't get any movement on this?
That's what it always is, right? It's follow the money. We've seen lawsuits coming out recently where it's the loan servicing companies, it's the CEOs, and in the student loan borrower industry, if you could call it that, right? You see
Crazy.
lobbying very similar to what we see in the carceral lobby, right? In the pharmaceutical lobby. There are people who just have an interest in keeping things the way they are because it makes them richer and it keeps the working class working harder than we should.
Yeah, I'd love to know where those thousands of dollars in interest that I've paid over the last decade, like where did that go? Whose, I don't know, private jet did that help pay for, or yacht, or I don't know.
Well, Wells
I have
Fargo-
more research, but I'm sure it's going into someone's yacht.
Yeah. Well, Wells Fargo executives, if you're watching, you're welcome for whatever fantastic meal you're having right now, because I'm paying.
I'm glad
for
I could
it.
I'm glad I could help subsidize your luxurious lifestyle. And I wanted to just briefly, like, the issue of student debt. So obviously we're for canceling it, but then what happens, right? Because then that whole system is still in play. So beyond just canceling it, what else do we need to do to make sure that there's not another generation of people who end up like us in 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years still paying off their student loans angrily and hoping someone will cancel their debt?
College should be free. I think that there are certain things that we have not acknowledged should be basic human rights, especially in one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Housing should be a human right, healthcare should be a human right, and access to a good quality education. And couple that with clean air and water, and I'm a happy girl. I wouldn't ask for much more than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this. You said you're going down to D.C. on April 4th. For those who are interested in everything you all are doing there at Roots Action on this issue, I bet there's a lot of them watching. Where can people go to find out more and get involved?
Yeah, I've for the last year become sort of a Twitter freak. So you can follow me on Twitter at India Walton from Buffalo. Follow Roots Action also on Twitter, and visit our website at rootsaction.org.
Well, India, we really appreciate you giving us some time. I know you got a lot going on, but it was really an honor to have you here with us on the Freedom Side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and have a great day.
You too. Well, yeah, I mean, this is, I think, we talked about this a million times before, Rania. I mean, it's like one of the main topics of discussion, sadly, amongst so many Americans, is how we're shelling out all our cash to these student loan industries. And the point that India was making about the not even having paid the principal, one of the most demoralizing things for me for so many years was I think I paid for like 4 or 5 years before the principal moved at all. And I was just like, I'm giving you so much money right now. How is it possible it hasn't even dropped like $300. And now I think it's dropped a couple thousand, but still it doesn't look great.
Well, you know what else they do, these loan servicing companies, is like I've had several in the last decade, right? So like I don't even remember the name of the first loan servicer that I was like paying back my loans to, but then they make money selling it to another servicer, selling it to another servicer. It's like this whole weird scheme. And sometimes when they sell your loans, they capitalize them, meaning they take the interest and put it into the principal. And so that makes your principal higher. And then you have to pay interest on that higher amount, which is like another crazy scheme that I don't even know how that's legal. So I kept being confused. I'm like, man, like I keep paying these stupid loans, but like you said, that number isn't going down. I bet you they put it all together. They put it like they must have sold it to another servicer and then just capitalized your loans without really saying much.
And then they have the companies, that mail you obsessively about your high loans and about how they're going to help you get your loans down and resolve your loans. Of course, you got to pay them too. But the whole thing is such a racket. I mean, it's such a
predatory.
It is.
It's so unbelievably predatory. And to have these politicians that are worth millions or in many cases, tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to tell us that we're brats and we're selfish and why can't you just handle pay back the loans you took out? I'm like, did you even pay for college? No, because your parents
most of them are so
did.
old.
Like,
back when they went to college, it was so cheap. Anyone could go.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable.
Right.
And but I don't know if you had this experience. I mean, they were just telling me all sorts of stuff on the phone. I'll never forget the first time I took out a student loan to like allay my fears at taking out an extra $20,000. They said, well, don't worry about it. You don't have to pay it back till you graduate, right? That's 3 years from now, so you don't have to worry about it anytime soon. I mean, it was like, these saccharine sweet phrases they had to get you to take out more and more money and just say, out of sight, out of mind. Deal with it later. It's going to be fine. But yeah, you look at these people.
Which is easy when you're younger.
No disrespect to our senior citizens. Obviously, I support our senior citizens 100%, and they need to be supported better. Most of our senior citizens living on fixed incomes. But you look at these millionaire politicians who are almost all 70, 80, 60, so old. And again, no disrespect. When you look at when they went to college, how much it cost because of the level of public investment that took place, it was
$30.
nothing. It was nothing.
Yeah, it was like
and you could work your way through college, all these different elements, and we've had the destruction of public investment into higher education, and we've had a whole other range of things that have happened that have turned student loans into a major financial product and commodity, but it's criminal, really.
It's everything. I think about my own parents who obviously they immigrated to the U.S. They worked very like working class, sometimes working poor. I don't know what they were up and down through those two classes, I suppose. And on their really tiny, meager incomes, they were able to buy a home. I mean, I can't even fathom doing that in America today. Like there is something to be said about there was a time when, America, as awful and imperialistic as it's always been, did have a certain level of investment and affordability to it that just does not exist anymore. So there is an older generation that is incapable of understanding that the kind of financial hits that people below them are going through. And just to bring that home for a moment, you mentioned some of these politicians like being in their 80s. Nancy Pelosi, I saw a photo of her circulating. Did you see it?
Yeah, the one from the Kennedy inauguration. I've seen that a couple times. But you know why she was there, right?
No, I don't know why she was there.
Her father was the mayor of Baltimore and was one of the biggest Democratic Party bosses in the country.
That's like mafia
stuff.
That's mafia stuff. The Baltimore mayor of Baltimore is like.
That's Italian Americans, are
no, I didn't even mean it like that. I
labeled.
meant the leadership. The leadership in Baltimore. Come on, the leadership.
I'm not going to speak to that. I'm not going to speak to that. I'm going to say that Baltimore is a great city, fantastic history. Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Greek Americans as well. Obviously, African Americans. I'm just defending the city of Baltimore against your slander. I don't know what's going on here, but I just want people who are watching from other countries, Rania, of which we have many, to know that what they see in the movies is not true. All right.
We just lost a bunch of Pelosi and apparently Baltimore politics supporters. Just like hundreds of them have
interesting.
unsubscribed from Breakthrough News because of my
just for
slander.
Breakthrough News. I just want all the Italian Americans watching to know that at least Eugene Puryear does not subscribe to this completely false thing that's been put out there by Hollywood about the Italian American experience in America, which is very, very different. Includes a lot of radicalism, labor radicalism, communism. Okay, Vito Marcantonio, the one communist individual to be in Congress from the Italian American community.
Are you suggesting that Nancy Pelosi's father was a clean, good Baltimore mayor that had ties to communism?
I'm not saying that at all. In fact, it's probably the exact opposite, given the time period he was mayor and what happened with mayors then.
At least we can agree with that.
We can.
The point is, Nancy Pelosi, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, does not have to ever, her children, her grandchildren, her grandchildren's grandchildren will not have to pay a penny for stolen earth, will not have to pay a penny for school. Or if they do, it won't be even thought about because they'll all be taken care of for eternity because of how rich this woman is. Yet
they'll be eating expensive ice cream. No doubt about that.
Oh, from $30,000, double fridges. Jesus Christ. But yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable to see that level of disconnect.
It is
from our political class. Yeah,
it is. Well, we'll come back to mid-century big city politics and the Kennedy administration on another show of the Freedom Side, which is a very interesting story. But nevertheless, that is going to bring us to a close. Don't forget, you can support us at patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can and should subscribe to our Telegram channel, which is there, Telegram at Breakthrough News. So check us out on Telegram as well. And of course, all your other social media platforms at BT Newsroom. And you can always check us out online at breakthroughnews.org. And if you are watching on YouTube, I guess you have to be watching on YouTube, should go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell to get the alerts. And as always, Ronnie and I will see you next week.